Welcome back to the TrailerSmith. Today we are going to change a spring on a tandem axle, 3,500 pound axle trailer. We're going to kind of go back old school. We're going to use just basic tools. If you travel up and down the road, these are tools that you should have in your vehicle. You may want to think about, and we'll talk about it, maybe keeping an extra part or two depending on how much you travel. If you're in a travel trailer and you're going across country, you may want to have a few parts in order to take care of this. Usually what causes this is wear and tear on the spring, just lack of maintenance. But what also causes it, you hit a big pothole, you go off the edge of the road, maybe you're having to go to a campsite, maybe it's an unimproved road, you'll hit a big pothole or something, it can break the spring or even bend the spring, and you need to change it, and you may be out in the middle of nowhere. So I'm not going to use any air tools. Maybe you might want to invest in a affordable electric impact, or if you can swing it, get you Milwaukee, something like that. That would make this a little easier. But I'm just going to put some old elbow grease in today and see how heavy I can breathe by the time this video is over. So the first thing we're going to do is loosen the lug nuts before I jack this up, and where the tire is free spinning, we're just going to crack them loose. I'm going to use a breakover. This would be handy to have with you. These look like a 13/16 head. Got lucky. Sometimes they're 3/4, that's not uncommon. Your bigger trailers are going to be 13/16 socket or a 7/8. Like I said, not taking them all the way off, just get them loose. Okay, and I'm not going to use the big fancy shop jack. I'm going to use the little jack here. So in this scenario, we would leave this hooked up to our tow vehicle. This is kind of simulating if you're on the side of the road, or maybe in a campsite, or maybe the best place to do it, even if you break a spring, many times you can limp it on down the road to go to a pull off. Preferably find you a parking lot or something like that, so that you have some hard surface to be on, because if you're in sandy or soil that's wet, you're going to block it up or something like that. I was going to do this out in the parking lot in the gravel just to go real old school, but the vehicle traffic is so loud today we could not hear out there, and the wind's blowing about 25 miles an hour. So try to find you a good hard surface spot, not out in the middle of the road. Just limp it to where you're going to go to change this out. It's also handy to keep you one jack stand, at least if you have room. Keep you a couple of these. We're going to do this with a one jack stand method. We're only going to take one tire off. If you have the stuff to do it, go ahead and jack the whole side up, support both sides of the axles off the ground. If we were in a shop situation, we would actually do the whole trailer. That way there's no pressure on the axles. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Doing it this method, you are going to have some pressure on the axle. So we're going to find a spot to jack this up. You can jack it here underneath the equalizer if you've done it before, if you're comfortable, if you get it right on the money. The issue is, if you get off to one side, it can cause it to slip. So I'm going to go straight to the frame and jack it up that way. So I'm going to tell you, I already know that this jack is not going to be tall enough to get on the frame. So I'm going to use a hardwood block. This will be something good to have around with you. So the tire is off the ground there. We got our jack stand under. We're going to go ahead and take the lug nuts and take the tire off before we bring it down, just in case, so the tire does not contact the ground. So now we're going to let the jack down on the jack stand so it's supported there. And now we're going to use our jack to go under the axle, because it will have a little pressure on it. It won't have a ton, but just to make it easier to manipulate the spring and get it off. See, it ain't got much. You can move that up and down by hand nearly. These jacks are pretty handy. You got to be careful with them though. If you're using a big trailer, I'd recommend getting something a little heavier. The reason I own this jack is I had an O2 sensor go out on a Yukon years ago on the side of the highway near San Antonio, and I had to use this thing to jack it up so my fat butt could get underneath it to pull the starter off and change the O2 sensor in a hotel parking lot. So this has been put to service before, and so we're going to use it again today. So the first thing we want to do is loosen the U-bolts. Most of those are going to be a 3/4, and they may be rusted. If you go to the coast or you go up north, I would recommend having some type of penetrating oil. These are even smaller than a 3/4. And make sure, yep, I'll be back. So now that I got the right socket, 11/16, like I said, most of the time these are 3/4. But you just never know. This one looks like it may have had a crescent wrench on it at some point. I went ahead and used a ratchet to get these nuts loose. That way it didn't take me all night. Use whatever you got. If you've only got the breakaway, it's going to take you a while. So now the U-bolts are loose. I'm going to knock the plate off. This plate has been hit before, so somebody bottomed out. As you can see there, somebody got a little close to something. Sometimes when that happens, that can get up against a nut and make it very, very difficult. If we were in the shop working, we would just cut the U-bolt off so they're not to be reused. We never recommend using these unless you're stuck on the side of the road. You cannot get a new U-bolt, and it's just to get you to where you can get a new U-bolt. So in that case, you can go ahead and use them. So now you see we have the spring is loose, tension is off, but the spring seat's still setting on a little bit, so we're just going to bump the axle up. So now we've got a clear spring. Something I didn't mention, you know, depending on what you've got in your trailer, if you have this thing loaded with a skid steer, you know, or if it's a cargo and RV similar to this, you may have to unload some of your gear. You don't want to do this under load. If possible, you can have a minimum load, but if that dude is loaded to the gills, you're going to have to tote some of that stuff off just to keep it safe. So now we're going to move on to the shackle bolts. These can be a booger. Sometimes they're tack welded in place. We do that. That being said, we put a tack on it that can be broke, or you know, it can be broke by hand, but especially with like an electric or a cordless impact. So we do that. So we're going to take out these two bolts and the one on the rear hanger and drop this spring. So I'm going to remove these two bolts next. Now something I'm going to do, I'm going to loosen them until they're ready to come out. Then I'm going to hand tighten the nut back on. I'm going to keep both of them in place along with the rear, because right now I have my arm underneath here, and if this spring is not intact and that jack were to slip, it can come down and make contact. Not likely, it would probably stop before it got there, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to make sure I'm back up top, and then we'll pull these out, drop the spring, and go in with the replacement. So you can see these are pretty wobbly. That is a worn suspension. It at least needs new bushings and new bolts in it. These bolts, they have splines on the head. They press in. They usually don't free spin. This one free spins. So that being said, you can loosen it from either side, but a lot of time if it's pressed in, you're going to have to loosen the nut and just back up the head of the bolt. Most of the time, this is a 13/16 head. The nut is 7/8, but that's not always the case. Sometimes from the factory, they will use a shouldered bolt that is going to have a smaller nut on it. Sometimes it's going to be a 3/4 on there. So don't be surprised if you see that. Don't be surprised if you see a mixture of that on some trailers. So let's see if we can grunt this dude off. These are going to be tight. So this being so tight, I really can't get in there to back it up and hold it. So I'm going to interlock my 2 wrenches. Old mechanic trick. I'm going to let them ride against the ground. So now it's like an extra set of hands. And just take your time, because that dude is tight. Now we're getting somewhere. As you can see, the suspension flipped over. That's no big deal here. Now the wrench is a little closer to the ground, so it'll help us to get it off. When we go to put the spring back on, it'll be fine. So we got the nut off of the rear bolt that's on the hanger. This one was still seated in really good in the hanger, which is pretty normal. So you're gonna take a hammer or something to knock that loose. There's no pressure on that bolt. That's simply just from the splines and some rust holding in there. Now the spring is free. We're not gonna be underneath it anymore. So at this time, if you're just changing it to get by or get you on the road, you don't have to take this bolt out or the shackle straps, but if they are worn, if they're cracked, if they're super loose, I would recommend changing them out. This suspension is loose. It is gonna get a full suspension job. If you look down at the bushing here, you can see it is worn out. I will actually pop that out. I'll go get a screwdriver and we'll get that out. And I will show you that that nylon bushing is worn through and the bolt's been starting to rub into the spring surface itself. So I'll show you that, then we'll get the new spring and get this dude wrapped up. Got our money's worth out of that bushing. Like I said, it's worn all the way through, and there's not much there, but there is some there that just keeps the two surfaces from meeting. So once you wear past that, you'll start to wear down into the spring. At that point, you're going to have to replace it regardless. So this is a 4-leaf spring. We're going to go back with a 4-leaf spring on this trailer. The one I'm putting back is going to be a little heavier, but note that if you're just replacing one spring from breaking or whatever have you, make sure it's the same weight rating. I always recommend if you've broken one, at least replace 2 of them. If you can only get one, do what you got to do. Or if it's a new trailer and you know the springs have not been overworked and you just happen to break one or you've hit something, that's fine. Just replace the one on there. And again, if you need new shackle straps, this is the time to do that. But if you're trying to get down the road, it's fine. Just leave that on there as long as it's not worn out. Put your new spring, get your tire back on, and get to where you're going. So we got our new spring. We're gonna hang our spring in the rear hanger first. Just gonna hand tighten the nut. Most nuts are lock nuts. If you see some indentions on them or the hole has been deformed, that goes to the outside. That way it locks down when you tighten it up, and we'll tighten it up here in a minute. We're gonna move back to the shackle strap. If you will notice, these bolts are put in from the outside in. And I will tell you, most manufacturers do that. And I think somebody said it best one time, well, the manufacturer disagrees with me. I'll tell you, the manufacturer disagrees with me on several things, and that's okay. There's things that the manufacturer does great, and there's things that we do better than the manufacturer, and we're humble enough to admit that. I'm gonna tell you the reason behind this. They do this because it's easy to put it on there in the manufacturing process. The problem is if your bolt is in like this, and God forbid the nut comes off or you lose it, and this bolt works its way out, it's gonna cut the sidewall out of the tire. You're gonna lose the tire and possibly lose control. If it's in like this and it comes out, it's just gonna fall out. The spring's gonna hit up against the frame. You're gonna be able to slow down, get to where you're going. So sometimes the manufacturers don't get it right. Sometimes we have to improve it, upgrade it from a service standpoint. The difference between us and a manufacturer many times, we're not trying to pump out quantity, we're trying to pump out quality in that and to make it better down the road. Another trick you can do, I do this for some of our guys that pull a lot of miles on bumpy roads. If you see this bolt, this is a 3-inch, this is a 3.5 inch. So a little hack you can do on this, you can double stack your shackle straps. Where this has one, you can actually double stack this with the longer bolt, double stack both sides, and it will give you double the meat on there. You can also buy these that are double thickness and even some that have grease zerks in there. So either way will work fine. So you can replace it with that and just get you a little more longevity, and you don't have to do the maintenance as quick. again, you know, just like buying a new vehicle, sometimes they put cheap tires on to get started, and they'll last you 20, 30,000 miles, then you got to put you a good one on. Same way with some of the suspension bolts, tires, parts, all of it. So sometimes you got to do better than manufacturer. So just keep that in mind when you're working in a trailer and putting it back together. We sure do. So here's, it's important. A while ago, it was down like this. You cannot assemble it like that right now. It needs to be up above, up above. So now we're going to tighten this bolt down. Again, you can see the splines on there. So you have two options. You're gonna need to back it up on the back side, and this head, you don't want it to spin. As you tighten the nut out here, it will pull the splines in there. We usually do that to get started, then we'll take a hammer or something and slightly tap, not enough to bend the head or deform the head, but just to help seat the splines, then finish tightening the bolt off, and then we'll show you the proper tightness for this. Now we have tightened our shackle bolt all the way down. The head is seated all the way where it needs to be. You can't leave it like that. If you leave it like that, your suspension is going to get stuck. Sometimes we see them like that from the manufacturers. Our guys, when we have a load of trailers come in, they check every suspension bolt before it hits the ground, because sometimes they won't have the head seated in all the way, or they will have it too tight where the suspension is going to get stuck, because they are mass producing these things. So you need to make sure you check that. If you want to know how much to loosen it off, I don't have an exact number. You want just to loosen this just to get you some travel in this. You'll be able to tell once you pull this back. You just don't want to pull it all the way off. This is a locking nut, so we're just going to loosen it just a little bit. And you can feel it give right there. It has got some play in it. It's going to move up and down. Another way you can check that, once we reattach the axle and move it up and down, you will see this movement in here. It just can't be stuck. This one is very loose through here. Like I said, again, we have to change all the suspension out. We're doing this just for the video today. So now we're going to let the axle down. So we're going to take some pressure off of the jack. And we got to make sure, if you can see the little pin in there, that pin has to go up in the bottom of that axle seat. There's a hole in there that has to go in. And sometimes you got to finesse it. Sometimes you may have to push your spring that way or that way. Now it's in there, and now we can put our U-bolts on. Just make sure when you're tightening it, you don't tighten one all the way down. Tighten them evenly. Also, make sure on the bottom of the plate, you're not going to be able to see it on here, but make sure the spring tie bolt, which is what goes through the hole in the spring seat, make sure it goes through that bottom plate. That keeps everything from shifting. All right, they're tight. We can remove our handy dandy floor jack. And now we're ready for the tire to go back on. Set the trailer on the ground and be on your way. Now remember, in this video, this was a get you by, get you down the road scenario. We always recommend, if you're gonna do your suspension, jack the whole trailer up, check everything out, and replace everything. These parts do wear out. Unfortunately, what we see, they usually don't get replaced until you've had a failure. Something's broke, something's worn completely out. We'll leave the links to everything that I can find on here in the description below if you're needing any suspension parts, and maybe a few of the tools or something. But everything that I showed in this video tool-wise is your bare minimum. That's good to keep that on your trailer. And I'm gonna tell you right now, if it were my trailer, I'm hauling a bunch, or especially if I have an RV that we're gonna be going across country or taking multiple camping trips, I'm gonna keep at least an extra spring, if not two. I would prefer to have two. I'm gonna keep an extra hub and or drum assembly with bearings, some shackle bolts, shackle straps, just a few of those things, because if it breaks down, you know as well as I do, it's gonna be out in the middle of nowhere. It's gonna be hard to find. So that stuff doesn't take up a bunch of weight. It doesn't take up a bunch of room. I'm gonna recommend keeping that on the trailer, just so when you break down, you don't have to depend on anybody else Or if you do have to call a service tech out there, roadside assistance, many times they don't have the parts. If you have the parts, man, they can get it knocked out and get you back on the road and get you going. So I hope this video was helpful, showing how to change one spring for this scenario. Keep up the comments. We've had a lot of feedback. Didn't talk about tires today. We're going to give y'all a break from talking about tires because my goodness, if you want to get some comments, just mention the word tire. I'm going to say it right now, tire. We will have some more videos coming at you soon.